Hello. So today we're looking at non-violent protest and particularly focusing on the action Seeds of Hope, where a group of women destroyed a warplane. And what happened next, we'll hear more about that in a minute. But we'll also talk about how does this relate to protest movements in the past and also right here in the present today. So we're very lucky today. We have Rowan here who has at least 30 years of activist experience and almost all of the nonviolent actions she's been involved with in that time have been highly successful, and Seeds of Hope is one of those successes, perhaps the most famous. But you might not know, Rowan has also broken into Buckingham Palace in 1993 over nuclear testing, which the government stopped just 1 year after this action. Rowan has also been involved in embedding nonviolence into the work of XR for the last 2 years and has been arrested multiple times as part of the rebellion. We've also got Joe Blackman, who also has a long background in the peace movement, was also part of the Seeds of Hope group that disarmed the Hawk jet in 1996. And that group, including Joe, received the Sean McBride Peace Prize. Since then, she's been occupied with being a mum, also being involved in climate campaigning, growing veg, and is a founder member of XR Shrewsbury, and has also been arrested multiple times as part of the rebellion. So we're going to start with hearing from you both about Seeds of Hope. So Rowan, maybe you can kick us off telling us how you decided to take this action and how you prepared for it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, from my point of view, I got involved with the Ploughshare. It's called Seeds of Hope Ploughshares, and it comes from the Swords into Ploughshares movement, which is probably more, at that time it was more well known in the US, so it was one of the first few actions that happened in this country. And it's just taking this principle that comes out of the Bible of beating swords into ploughshares, and the people that started the movement were Christians, and they just took that quite literally and said, right, let's do it. You know, this is what Christianity should be about. This is what Jesus was about, and took those principles as being non-violent, revolutionary, and went and disarmed weapons. And so this was, I think, it was the third action in Britain at that time, and we came together as a group of women to do these actions, and also probably one of the first groups that didn't have such an emphasis on the Christian side of things. I mean, many of us do have a a spiritual aspect, but that wasn't the main focus. And some activists referred to it as being one of the most strategic of the Ploughshares actions that took place. And so I was very interested, coming from the environmental movement. I was particularly interested in the method of the Ploughshares action and the emphasis that was put on non-violence, stretching the definition of non-violence to include damage to property, which I'd heard of before because it was also done at Greenham Common, which I'd been part of. But this was a much bigger deal, the idea of actually disarming a weapon, which millions of pounds, and the idea of claiming that as non-violent, which made total sense to me. But I could see that it was quite a difficult message to get across. And the other aspect of it was the idea of being accountable. So up until that time, I'd done actions covertly. At times, not always, but sometimes covertly. And the idea of being accountable, it just resonated with me immediately, because I could see how the power lies, the power in accountability is so much stronger. And that in a certain way, when you do actions covertly, you kind of short circuit the power that comes from non-violence. The idea of, being present to tell the story of the action. Was I found it very convincing. So I really wanted to get involved in the action to sort of test all that out. And of course, the idea of doing something for East Timor at that time, you know, was being oppressed by Indonesia. And, you know, the idea that this action might make a difference to those people was really compelling to me. So we came together as a group of women, and we prepared the action for 11 months. So we met every weekend for a month, and worked together on all the different aspects that we needed to do to you know, to develop a good strategy. And we also studied. We looked at the court cases of ploughshares activists who'd already done actions and who'd been convicted and put in prison for 6 months. And we looked at what was kind of needed really to be able to jump through the legal hoops, as it were, and entertain the possibility of getting an acquittal, which was, you know, unheard of at that time. The idea of being acquitted for an action like that was, you know, I mean, people laughed when we said that that's what we were trying to do. Is that enough? Do you want to add anything there, Jo, to that description?
Yeah, I mean, I think I first heard of ploughshares in about 3 years before our action, and I heard about one of the other ploughshares actions in Britain where Chris Cole disarmed the nose cone of a hawk jet, and that was also when I first heard about East Timor and how Indonesia had invaded East Timor, and it was being described as a genocide. Up to a third of the population had been killed, and the UN had condemned the invasion and the occupation, but Britain was still selling hawk jets and other weapons to Indonesia in defiance of international law, and it just seemed so outrageous to me. And it was like, and the connection, I think what really really I suppose engaged me, well, it was just such a direct connection. It was like, you know, in Britain, in this factory near me, these weapons are being manufactured and exported to this regime that, you know, there's eyewitness evidence that these weapons are being used to kill people in this genocidal situation. And it's almost like having that knowledge, what else can you do really other than take some action? And yeah.
So you decided to take action and be accountable. So
yeah.
What was that like, Jo? What happened during the action and then after in terms of taking accountability for it?
Okay. So so from the very first moment that we began to talk about doing this action, we decided it was going to be accountable in the tradition of the ploughshares movement, so that we were going to stay and take responsibility. That's like, you know, if we got into the site, we would, and if we managed to disarm the weapons, we would stay and take responsibility. And so because we knew we were going to do that anyway, we also in advance prepared witness statements. So we had our own statements saying why we were going to take this action, sort of statements of intention. And we also put together a video in advance about why we were taking the action, which included footage from East Timor, it included footage from Parliament showing the hypocrisy there, and actually part of a kind of commercial from British Aerospace saying that these planes deliver a powerful punch.
It's a fantastic strategy to bring a video and leave that at the scene of the crime. So in fact, the scene of the crime was transposed. You know, when the police talk about the scene of the crime, they're talking about the criminals, you know, that was supposed to be us. But actually, what we did was we turned that around completely and said, no, it was the British government and the arms trade that are the real criminals here.
I'm not sure why we haven't seen more memory sticks with evidence files left at actions.
Because when something is left as evidence at the scene of the crime, it has to be shown to the jury, it has to be shown to the world, you know. And so we were able to use that as a way to tell the story. And so that was another incredible success.
You actually took that on videotape, right? I recently had, and left it in the plane.
So so another part of the preparation phase was actually, carrying out recce's where we went to look at the site and so on. Anyway, so then eventually on the night of the action, we managed to use bolt cutters, entered the site. It's a huge site, about getting on for 2 miles across on one where there's actually a runway. And we'd seen the Hawk jet being test flown, so we knew the serial numbers, which we'd managed to get from a military aircraft magazine. And we on our daytime recce, we'd seen the plane being test flown and put away, so we knew which hangar it was in. And we went up there, so it was late one evening, and cut the perimeter fence, kind of ran up to the big, huge hangar, which had cameras on every corner, floodlit. Managed to open the door with a crowbar. Once we were inside, there were actually 18 planes in there, but only one was a Hawk jet. And it was really important for us to restrict ourselves to that one jet, because it's also about it's real direct action, stopping that plane going, but it's also, we want to have a clear message. We don't want to just go and disarm all the other planes as well. We don't know anything about them, but we wanted to keep it really focused on this particular situation and context. And we use ordinary household hammers to hammer on the plane. And that was also, I suppose, there's a lot of symbolism, I guess, as well. It's also saying this is something that anyone can do, that in theory, that it's low tech. It's just, this is also pretty much pre-internet, pre-mobile phone days. So we had no phones with us, nothing. So we hammered on the nose cone, the control panel, the wings, and then we hung up a banner that we'd brought with us. So we wanted to, I suppose part of our understanding of nonviolence was to ensure that the situation wouldn't be threatening to anyone that found us. So that, a security guard walks in. As soon as we'd done 1 or 2 hammer blows, we got our banner out and hung it on the plane. And that was very clear. It had messages about it. It was women for life and justice, and kind of a very colourful banner with lots of positive images on it as well. So there's this idea as well about transformation, that we in an ideal world, if we had the resources and time, we'd be trying to convert that plane into something useful, but we can at least have images that indicate that. And we left photos on the plane as well of children from East Timor and children that we knew. And then once we kept expecting that someone would appear, that security would appear. But time went by, and we'd had 20 minutes, and we'd done, plenty of hammering, put our banners up, etc. And then we actually noticed a security vehicle driving by outside. So we actually went to the door that we'd come in by and waved at it, but it didn't see us. And then went back with a bit more hammering, and double checked again around the hangar and whatever. But in the end, we actually found a phone in the hangar, and we decided to ring the press to say what we'd done, because we partly for our own sakes as well, we were less keen on being found by the first shift of workers, and we just thought, okay, we've completed our task, we'll inform somebody. And yeah, sure enough, that then triggered the security arriving. Some of us were known to the security there because we'd had a peace camp outside the site. And actually when they turned up, although they looked, yeah, I mean, they were clearly shocked, probably, you know, probably worried about their own jobs, you know. They took us to the security lodge at reception, and in fact we were even offered a cup of tea there, and so there was a sense of we were not perceived as threatening in any way, and that was important to us, that we did this in a way that was not intimidating to anyone and not blaming of individuals, or, you know, or of the security that worked there, or the workers, the engineers, or anyone. And so that was something we were trying to convey with all of our banners, our video, the booklet. Okay, and we'd also tried to think very carefully, because obviously it's quite significant property damage that we did, and we were subsequently charged with £1.5 million worth of criminal damage. And, you know, so we did, also because it's a plane, we did spend some time investigating what was safe to do and making sure that that the action wouldn't actually place anyone at physical risk. So yeah, we did the best possible kind of health and safety process in advance as well, thinking all of that through. Okay, and that leads us on to being arrested and charged. I don't know, should I carry on there, or do you want
yeah, so you just did over £1 million worth of damage, and then what happens? Did you want to come in, Rowan?
Well, I just come in with a funny story.
Yeah, because
I was rung up when they were still in the hangar, and the person in the house that I was sharing the house with somebody, and they answered the phone, and it was like 3 o'clock in the morning or something. And then of course after they came and got me, and I talked to Angie about it, and she said they, you know, that the hawk had been disarmed, and then the person in the house wanted to know what had happened, so I told them, and this person was promptly sick. He actually vomited because he was so shocked, because at that point he realized that the meetings that we'd been having were taking place in our house, and, you know, he was quite sort of scared by it. So yeah, it was quite a thing for him. But of course we were of course over the moon and very excited and celebratory, and immediately got going with press releases, sending out press releases about the action that we'd already sort of half prepared in advance.
Yeah, so as someone who was involved in a support role, do you want to tell us a bit more about how that was done, or how important it is to have support roles as well as the people who are risking actually being put on remand and going to trial?
Yeah, so the support work was a hugely important part of the action, and you know, of course, you know, the 4 women that did the hammering was the most important bit, but it couldn't have taken place without the support, and it was really important for them that there were people outside that could kind of carry the story out to the world, and my role in it was to do the press work. But we also, you know, did all sorts of work. We gave talks to people. I remember I gave a talk in the school at one point, because once the action started to land in the papers and the public, there was a lot of interest in it, you know, but it was a huge amount of work, and the press work, you know, especially was really hard. At first, surprisingly, it was really hard work getting press coverage for it. People found it quite complex story, and they didn't understand what we were, you know. I remember when I was kind of cold calling the press and saying 4 women have just disarmed a Hawk jet, they just didn't know what I was talking about, you know. And so it was a lot of work to get the interest in the first place. And at one point I remember saying, this is so much work, if we don't make the front page of the Times at the end of it, then I'll be saying it hasn't been worth it. And here we are. front page of the Times.
Great.
So it was definitely worth it. Yeah, it was also emotionally quite hard for us, because we were, in a way, we were the interface between the four of them in prison and the rest of the world. Yep. And the responsibility of that, but it was also the responsibility of just looking out for them. You know, that was really challenging, you know, to kind of watch out for them all the time. At one point, the prison system decided to really sort of quite oppress them, and started doing these, you know, almost ritualized room searches and strip searching of them. And it was quite clear that it was a way to kind of oppress them. And we immediately took that, and we went to journalists about it and told them what was happening. And a journalist from The Independent, Hugh O'Shaughnessy, did a fantastic piece about how they were being oppressed whilst they were in prison. And then, of course, it completely stopped and they started to be treated properly. So our role was really important for things like that, you know, those kind of almost like their welfare, as well as taking the story out to other people.
Yeah, having worked as a legal observer and also as police station support and press sometimes all at the same time, well, not as a legal observer at the same time, I know that it can be quite difficult being stuck between the activists and the action you've been involved with and people's family as well as the press. It's quite emotional to actually do that witnessing work of watching someone else go through that. And that's often been just for, you know, when someone's arrested for less than 24 hours. How long, Joe, were you actually put on remand for, and how long was this trial process?
So we were on remand for 6 months at Risley Remand Centre, but I think we were expecting that, and in some ways we thought that it was almost inevitable that we'd spend some time in prison, and we actually, if anything, had a slight preference for spending time on remand, because you got more rights as a remand prisoner than as a sentence prisoner. And then if we had been found guilty and got a sentence, that time would have been taken off the sentence. So we were kind of completely prepared for it, well, as prepared as anyone can be. We during that remand period, we went to court several times. I mean, mainly it's like short hearings that are about just making brief arrangements, and then the trial was at the end of the 6 months, and that was a 6-day trial. Our main defence in law, we used the it's the Criminal Law Act 1967, Section 3, which says that a person may use reasonable force in the prevention of crime. So we argued that we were using reasonable force to prevent the crime of genocide in East Timor. And then there's 2 sub-conditions, which are that you have to have that the threat has to be imminent, and you have to have exhausted other means before resorting to force. And we could show that the threat was imminent because we'd seen those planes being test flown. We knew they were ready to be delivered. And we could also show that we'd exhausted all other means. We'd been part of a widespread national campaign, and we'd done all the things such as writing to MPs and going on vigils and demonstrations. And I think, sometimes people say to me, well, what's the point of writing to your MP? And I am very skeptical that writing to an MP in itself is going to change much. But it's a step that I feel it's important to show you've done, that you go through that step, and it then makes it makes it easier to progress to the next step, and you kind of so the trial, go on.
those escalation of stages of action seem to, I think, be important both within court and without of court in terms of how one prepares oneself for an action, but also justifies it as non-violent. It seems like that's a process that a lot of different activists go through, whether or not they're trying to justify it in a court of law, as part of that preparation for taking this more kind of serious action. So you're a peace group and you decided to smash up a warplane. Do you want to just briefly say again how, I mean, you've talked about it in a lot of detail, but how did you square that as non-violent? Was it those steps that you took, or was there something else? Was it the fact that the damage was so much less than what was clearly going on in East Timor?
I think that with a weapon, its purpose is destruction and harm, and it's, so for me it's about dismantling that weapon. It's disarming it. We use that language of disarming it. You're kind of neutralizing it. You're making it safe. So it's, to me, I think when I first came across the idea, I struggled with it a little bit, but I think it wasn't, and then I kind of came to that understanding that this is something that its only purpose is to harm, and it's fine to just to do damage to it in a way that just makes sure it can't be used. You're just putting it out of action. Obviously just making sure that in the process of doing that damage, you don't present a risk to somebody. So, you need to think about fuel tanks or whatever, and not do something that could be a fire risk or an explosion risk. So there are things to think about like that, but doing it safely and making sure that weapon can no longer be used.
So
doing it accountably as well. So it's you're taking the responsibility afterwards, and you're saying it's almost like inviting your fellow citizens to reflect and to say, well, literally we had a jury, so you're literally going up, your fellow citizens have a chance to decide whether that was justified or not. And that I think part of the non-violence is being willing to submit myself to that process and I know the criminal justice system is fundamentally flawed, but it's while we have a jury system, that is an important part.
And in this instance, the jury obviously decided.
Yes. So completing the story of the trial, the jury came back with a not guilty on all counts basis. So I think I forgot to mention earlier that we also had a charge of conspiracy. So it was criminal damage of £1.5 million and conspiracy to cause criminal damage, and we were acquitted on all charges by the jury.
Amazing.
Woohoo!
So Rowan, at what point or was this action a success, and at what point was it a success? Because obviously from the moment you got in the hangar and you realized that the security guards weren't coming, even when you tried to wave them down, and you did destroy this warplane, that in itself was obviously a success. That plane wasn't going to be used to continue a genocide. Then there was also obviously the court case where you were found not guilty. That was some kind of success. Then there's obviously we haven't heard so much. We've heard a little bit about what was going on in the media in relation to it. So how did you measure success, and at what point did you decide this action was a success? Because that's something that all activists, I think, struggle with, because it's so hard to pinpoint.
Totally. And I mean, something that I found very interesting was, you know, how much emphasis went on the acquittal. And of course, it was fantastic. I mean, it was a huge gasp around the court, you know, and, you know, it was an incredible celebration of nonviolent action. And in a way, there's a way in which that can eclipse a more fundamental importance, which actually started when we first came together and decided to do this. And that was the first success, actually, you know, to have a small group of people come together and say, okay, we're going to take this on, you know, and we're going to see if we can change things. I mean, that's huge, you know, in terms of, challenging obedience, the obedience of our society, which we're trained to be obedient from, you know, from birth, and to start to question that in itself is already an incredible success. And then after that, you know, that, you know, actually getting into to hammer the warplane. And you know, one of the things that for me makes this non-violent is that non-violence has this idea that, you know, we don't have the solution and the answers, but it happens in the dialogue that takes place, and that begins right at the beginning of the action when you start to prepare it. And when you question, you know, that, because there should be deep questioning on the part of the activists, because this is an extreme thing to do. So, you know, activists, you know, should really reflect on, is this the right thing? You know, can we do this in a way that people will be able to understand? And you know, to sort of tick all those boxes, if you like, the legal hoops and so on. And that's part of the dialogue that should take place when an action is non-violent, where you're inviting people in all the time at each stage of the process. And, you know, when they were in prison, in the way that they interacted after they did the disarmament, and the way that they tried not to cause fear on the part of the workers or the people that found them, and in the way that we, you know, we told the story of the action to the press and so on, was also part of taking that dialogue out. And at that point, it's not about saying we've got the answer. It's about saying, hey, come into this discussion, come and be part of this story, and help us breathe life into it, you know. And in that process, I think this, in a way, the action takes on a life of its own, and it kind of, it goes much more deeply, I think, into people's hearts, and challenges their ideas on a kind of mental level as well, to really think, well, you know, what should people be doing? And, you know, just to bring climate change in here, you know, we've got a situation that's actually much more extreme. You know, this was one nation. It was extreme enough. It was one nation, East Timor. We're talking about billions of people. And so to take an action on this kind of scale in relation to climate change, you know, I think would be, I would argue, would be appropriate if there was something like that could be done that would prevent climate change.
Yeah, so to come on to the wider issues there then, so I've got some geese here coming to join while we talk about the environment. So I have about 10 years experience of taking different kinds of actions, also in the anti-arms trade movement, about 3 years ago now. So I guess if you talked, Joe, about how you made sure the scene of the action was read in a non-threatening way, you know, with banners and with household items. But when we look at sort of the more mass protest situations, as we've seen with Extinction Rebellion and the school strikes, what are some of the considerations or ways to portray that space as a non-violent space, or to ensure that we keep those mass spaces as non-violent, if that's the strategy a group has chosen, like XR has chosen that strategy?
So like what kind of characteristics are we looking for in an action like that, you mean?
Yeah, or what are some of the practical things, like, so Joe hung the banner over the plane and used certain symbols on the banner. So is there certain things that you can bring, like flowers or certain messages on banners, or what are some of the ways that can be done in those mass situations? Because I know, Rowan, you've been involved in embedding nonviolence into those protests.
Yeah. Well, any kind of images that you know celebrate life. I mean, we took seeds, or the 4 women that did the action took seeds and ashes and sprinkled them on the plane, and that image was also taken out into the court situation. So outside the court, we had a kind of a ceremony in which people burnt the names of the people of East Timor who'd been killed during various massacres and collected the ashes in a bowl, and then added that to that seeds to symbolize life. And you know, that was a really beautiful way to bring the in a way the poetry of an action like that. You know, I mean, I think that nonviolence can be an incredibly beautiful thing, and deeply moving. And I think there's something about the extremity of an action like, you know, hammering a Hawk warplane. You know, it does help people to connect with the, you know, the deeper reasons why we should be taking actions like this, by bringing these images in front of people. You know, the burning of the names of people who've been killed, you know, very palpably brings it into people's consciousness. But also, I mean, the idea of, you know, well, you know, being truthful, you know, the idea of being accountable is also about trying to bring the truth of something. And I think when you bring the truth of something into the arena, it also develops trust, you know, which is also really important. And, you know, especially if you're doing something that people will consider to be extreme in normal circumstances, they need to know that they can trust you. And I think nonviolent action, when it's done well, it kind of accrues these, you know, characteristics like trust and respect and not harming, and the idea of it being part of a whole dialogue in which people are invited to be part of, rather than, you know, imposing our ideas on what we think should happen. Which I think is implicit in the demands, XR's demands, you know, the idea of having people's assemblies is also inviting a dialogue around the actions that we do, which is, you know, which is a kind of parallel, if you like, to the transformational element of Ploughshares actions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, we've heard about the accountability, and obviously you went on remand, Joe, but I think, yeah, it's really interesting to think about the performativity of these actions as well, and how art and creativity are really important to creating that collective space. As we saw with the Extinction Rebellion protest, there were people who were willing to be arrested, locking themselves to lorries, but there were also arts activities with families and young people who weren't there to be arrested, but they were all in that same space because we had these creative centerpieces to the actions, and created these beautiful collective spaces together, and all of that portrayed these actions as a non-violent and a welcoming space to have those dialogues, rather than it purely being a case of non-violence means, oh, that, you know, I will sit peacefully on the floor and quietly be arrested. That I think some people get the idea that it's very formulaic or something, or or inhuman, when actually it's about this celebration of life, as you said, Rowan.
Can I just add something about the importance of confrontation, because I think I didn't mention that earlier, and it just feels really important that people realise that non-violence isn't just something very passive in the way that you described, you know, people sitting down and being arrested. It can look passive, it can look ineffective, but I think for a non-violent action to really be non-violent, there needs to be an edge of confrontation to it. Otherwise there's no change. And of course, confrontation doesn't mean violence. You can confront something without actually being violent. And so, you know, this is a way in which non-violence, you know, it's not a passive thing. It's not about being peaceful. You know, being peaceful is something that you see on Christmas cards. It's not, you know, that's not part of non-violent direct action. It's about, you know, confronting injustice and lies, you know, with bold actions, you know, that dramatically demonstrate that and expose it. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
That's what I was gonna, yeah, exactly what I was gonna say. And it's kind of, so the thing about non-violence having a confrontational edge, it's about a challenge, it's about kind of pushing, it's not pushing back against injustice and oppression, but in a way that does not involve with is non-violent and is illustrating the world we're working towards as well. So it's kind of having that image of transformation and
And it's a strategic choice, right? But I think sometimes people assume, again, along with the assuming that it's a passive stance rather than a confrontational stance, they might assume that it therefore condemns, you know, historical actions or movements for change that haven't just taken that strategic non-violence pathway, or it assumes a separation or a condemnation of other groups who might be on the streets now, for example. So do you want to talk a bit more about that, those different approaches to non-violence that we've seen in history, and how you can take a decision on to use a tactic without condemning other groups necessarily?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the fact that non-violence came from people who were oppressed, you know, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, obviously the really famous ones, and you know, it was all about the freedom of oppressed people, and likewise Gandhi's the other famous guy, and you know, it was about independence for India, and you know, the people who were involved with that were the oppressed people, you know, of India, the poor people, and likewise when Gandhi was in South Africa, you know, he was oppressed as an Indian, and you know, thrown out of trains and all this kind of stuff. And you know, I mean, they're the famous ones, but there's loads of examples through history of different movements, you know, taking non-violent action. I
think it's good to remember when we think about those historical examples that maybe again, looking back, are seen as like acceptable or again even passive. They were actually very confrontational acts of non-violence at the time. They were labeled as extremists in the way that both non-violent and more violent groups now today are being labeled as extremists. So yeah, it is property damage, as that's what we're talking about here, really extremism.
Yeah, well, Martin Luther King had something to say about this. He said he was talking about rioting. In 1967, there were riots going on at the same time as non-violent actions, and he referred to them. He didn't condemn them. He said this is not an accident. This is something that has a message, and it's saying something. And then he went on to ask, why were they so violent with property then? Because property represents the white power structure which they were attacking and trying to destroy. So although he's not using property destruction himself, he's also raising the question about, well, you know, those people who are doing that, what is that about, you know, and bringing it into the, in a way, sort of framing it, you know, as something that is just. But I think, you know, there's a way in which nonviolence can get reified and can become a bit fossilized. And I think it's important to remember that those people were also, as you said, pushing the boundaries of what nonviolence, of what can be done about injustice. And I think it's important that we keep doing that. You know, we have to act from our own context.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in terms of context, bring it back a bit to today and Extinction Rebellion. Yeah, I think what this conversation for me is one of the important things it's highlighting is that process and that conversation that you went through for those, did you say 11 months in the build up to that Seeds of Hope action? And so, you know, as someone who's been campaigning around climate change for the last at least 5 years, obviously I might say, oh yeah, it's totally acceptable to go and do property damage and just jump to that conclusion. But what I think is important here is when we are escalating our actions and experimenting, because I also see Extinction Rebellion as an experiment in different types of disruption and disobedience, and always pushing those boundaries to see what we can do. It's really important to have these conversations and not just immediately accept one thing as acceptable or another thing as unacceptable. It's actually about how can we make these spaces where it's okay to talk about non-violence and it's okay to talk about property damage and where these things fit together.
Yeah, and I think you know, one of the elements of Ploughshares of Action is that it comes out of community and the idea of discussing together as a group what's acceptable and what's reasonable, what's proportionate to what we're, you know, which are legal hoops to jump through. But I think that, you know, they're important ones for us anyway, to reflect on what's reasonable and safe and proportionate. And I think that's a really important conversation that we need to keep having about what's okay and what can be understood by people, because it's all very well kind of claiming something to be non-violent, but will it land as non-violent? Will people be able to make sense of what you've done? Which is, of course, it's helped by accountability, but it's good if an action can stand on its own without that as well, so that it does make sense.
So you talked about accountability in your action. What other actions in your experience have shown how accountability or groups not taking accountability can be received differently in the press, or also how those groups can work together in one sort of direction of change? Yeah.
I was involved in the late 90s and noughties in a campaign to pull up genetically modified crops. In fact, that was an action that was partly inspired by the Seeds of Hope Ploughshares. And the first actions that were done, not by me, were done covertly, and it's quite interesting to see how that was portrayed in the media. You know, lots of masked up people looking a bit scary, and some of us then, there was 10 of us, started a campaign to pull the crops up accountably. And what was really interesting was to see the difference in the way that the media portrayed us. We were wearing these white kind of boiler suit things, but we also wore coloured headscarves. We never put the hoods up. And this was in the Times, so not a paper that you would expect to be particularly in favour. But they took this great photo, and we even had our phone number on it, so people could phone us up, and you know, it could be part of the recruitment. Yeah, it was quite striking how accountability in that campaign just made a huge difference to how it was received by the public. We produced a handbook for action that we put our names to, and that became part of an injunction that was taken against us, which we were able to sort of weave back into the campaign and use it in a positive way. But many activists at that time didn't agree with accountability, or they felt they couldn't take that kind of risk. And some of them continue to act accountably. And even though I still, I feel that the power of these actions is in the accountability in a way, because you can tell the story of what you're doing. So I kind of I wasn't really that keen on those kinds of actions. But looking back now, I can see how there was a way in which, because some of us were accountable, we were able to account for the people who didn't feel able to take those kind of risks. And maybe arguably there's something to be said for that working.
So I think this has been a really great beginning of looking at different kinds of non-violent protest, including on the extreme end of property damage. And it's been great to hear from Joe and Rowan about the Seeds for Change action that you were both involved with, and looking forward to more conversations about non-violence in protest.
Yeah, thanks Joe for coming, and yeah, thanks for hosting us, Liam.
Yeah, thanks to everyone.
Thank you.